I would like to welcome everyone today to the conference, the II Collaborative Conference on the Arts of Devotion, held virtually on Zoom. My name is Mary Gallagher. I'm the director of the International Institute. I'm also the Lowenstein Professor of Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights in the Department of Political Science. Before we begin today, we acknowledge that the University of Michigan, named for Michigami, the world's largest freshwater system, and located in the Huron River watershed, was formed and has grown through connections with the land stewarded by the Nishwe, Ishikodawan, Anishinabeg, the three fire peoples who are the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Wyandot nations. If you're new to Zoom, please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the webinar interface. Your mics are muted, but you can submit your questions for panelists in the Q&A box. There are also live transcripts available for ADA accommodations. This conference on Arts of Devotion brings together the University of Michigan, national and international scholars alike for compelling presentations and discussion around various forms of contemporary and pre-modern arts of devotion. There will be two panels and a keynote speaker to close out the event with built-in Zoom breaks throughout the day. Both panels and the keynote will begin with a special presentation from UMMA, the University of Michigan Museum of Art. We will begin shortly with our first panel, Devotion and Art in Contemporary Times, and you can view the full schedule at the link Gabrielle is providing in the chat, along with our speaker bios and our talk abstracts. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank all the staff who have participated and the centers that have collaborated on this II conference. It's been co-organized by the African Studies Center, the Center for Armenian Studies, the Center for Japanese Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Kenneth J. Lieberthal and Richard H. Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, the NAM Center for Korean Studies, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Center for South Asian Studies, and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. It's been co-sponsored by the Program in International and Comparative Studies, the History of Art, and the University of Michigan Museum of Art. So truly a collaborative conference. The event is also funded by our Title VI grants from the US Department of Education. I'd also like to thank the staff who have worked so hard on this conference, particularly to get it up and running in our remote environment, which is always more complicated. I'd particularly like to thank Gabrielle Graves, Elena Rodriguez, Kristen Waterbury, Evan Vowell, and Neil McKenna for organizing the conference, the II communications team, Rachel Britka, Raquel Buckley, and David Floyd Merchant. And the special thank you to Sasha Krasnow, a lecturer in the Islamic Arts and Culture in the Arts and Ideas in the Humanities program, and an affiliate faculty in the Arab and Muslim American Studies and the Center for Middle East and North African Studies. Professor Krasnow played a key role in outlining the themes and the goals for this conference, and we'd really like to thank her. I'd also like to thank all the LS&A technology services, namely particularly Keith Curras for their support in this Zoom webinar. And I'm now going to introduce the first moderator of the panel, the first panel for the conference, which is Devotion and Art in Contemporary Times. This is Rima Hassoneh. She is our community outreach coordinator for the Center for Middle East and North African Studies and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Rima. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure and a delight for me to be moderating the first panel. I'll briefly introduce the panelists, and then the first one will speak for 20 minutes and so on. So I'm delighted to welcome Sasha Krasnow, lecturer of Islamic Arts in the Residential College at the University of Michigan, and Christopher Checklian, postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Thank you to each of you for being here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Chaburka. I'm the curator for university learning and programs at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. Thanks for inviting me and my colleagues to contribute to your International Institute Conference, the Arts of Devotion. My colleagues and I have picked out a work of art to go with each of the panels, each of the two panels, and with the keynote. I am going to talk about a work of art that I picked out to go with panel 1. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of art and then connect it a bit to the themes that are in panel 1. So the piece of art that I picked is the one that we see on the screen right here. It's about life size. It's a 3D piece. It is actually made entirely out of the parts of guns, decommissioned weapons used to create the figure. You can see actual remnants of the guns that the figure is interacting with and standing on this mound of guns. So the piece that we're looking at here is called Apsara Warrior. It's by a Cambodian artist named Ukchim Vichet. It's from around the year 2004. And I picked this one because it's a great example of this sort of recasting of a devotional tradition for a new political purpose. So the context here. So the weapons that we actually see here were used to kill fellow Cambodians during the Civil War and the genocide under the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s and into the 80s. As part of the peace and reconciliation process, the Cambodian state had a campaign to a gun buyback campaign. So basically people could turn in guns to the state, get some money in return. And as a result, the Cambodian state had tons and tons of decommissioned weapons material that, what do you do with that sort of thing? So someone had this great idea, let's turn that into art. So they started a program called the Piece of Art Cambodia Project, PEACE, Piece of Art. And the idea was that artists would apply to this program with ideas for art that they would make out of this decommissioned weapons material. And a lot of that art was designed specifically to respond to the violent past that this weapons material came from. So there's this engagement with the Civil War, with the genocide, with the Khmer Rouge in this piece. Very important for the connection to your panel is the depiction of this figure as an Apsara figure or as an Apsara dancer. So let me show you the collection record really quickly. So Ukchim Vichet, Apsara Warrior is the name of the piece. It's from around 2004. So what's an Apsara? So a lot of you probably know what an Apsara is. Others probably don't. I'm going to go to Wikipedia, which I don't have on the page that I want. Let's open that right up real quick. Apsara. What's an Apsara? Apsara, are also spelled Apsaras, is a type of female spirit of the clouds and waters in Hindu and Buddhist culture. So here on this Wikipedia page, we see numerous representations of Apsara from various architectural sites. The one that I wanted to sort of end on as we scroll down through the Wikipedia page is this photograph of Khmer Apsara dancers. So this represents specifically a Angkorian, Cambodian, Khmer tradition that the artist, Ukchim Vichet, is drawing upon to create his piece, Apsara Warrior. So the Apsara dancers, the Apsara dances and the dancers are traditionally it's a form of ritual dance. It's about sort of telling stories about sort of the interaction between the heavens and the earth. And the Apsara are these sort of celestial figures who can go back and forth between the heavens and the earth and kind of help to mediate affairs between the two. During the Khmer Rouge regime, the Apsara dancers, along with many Buddhist traditions and many other things, were suppressed as being connected to sort of unjust class hierarchies from the past. So a lot of religious traditions were suppressed by the regime for specifically that reason. So here we have a devotional tradition that was suppressed by a regime that engaged in genocidal violence against the people. And here we have this artist, Ukchim Vichet, who is sort of resurfacing the figure of the Apsara dancer, but recasting them in the role of this kind of warrior figure, or maybe like an avenging angel type of figure, making them out of the very weapons of war that were used to suppress this tradition. And what we have this Apsara warrior who looks like they've kind of arrived on the scene to maybe do away with violence, breaking the gun. And the mound that is suggested by the rounded appearance of the platform that the figure is standing on suggests there's maybe a whole mountain of guns down there. So maybe a lot of work's been done, and yet there's still more to do. The piece is clearly an anti-war piece, but it's not simplistic. Really important is the fact that the figure is made out of the very weapons of warfare that it's trying to destroy, trying to do away with. So it's saying something about sort of like identity, subjectivity being constituted by the trauma of the past, and it's who we are even as we try to get away from it. Really powerful piece of sort of recasting a devotional tradition for a new political message. Connects up well to all of the papers in panel 1. Sheklian's panel or paper about Armenian music traditions, Armenian liturgical music traditions being recast over time for specific political purposes. Prepit Patmangal's piece on the Thai People's Party plaque is a similar sort of taking something very recognizable from the past and recasting it into new kind of playful forms or new ironic or satirical forms in order to say something critical about the tradition, about the tradition that work comes from. And then finally, Krasnow's piece on Alburak, I was struck by the sort of the gender ambiguity in the Alburak, both female and male. And we see a similar thing in the Apsara Warrior. Apsara traditionally females. The figure is gendered as female through like some of the details on the body, but then we have this kind of warrior figure, a sort of stereotypical male role. So we have the Apsara that's sort of female dancer, male warrior, and this maybe an avenging spirit or some sort of spirit coming from the heavens to try to set things right in the world, in the celestial or in the terrestrial plane, and do away with these weapons of warfare, yet made of them as well. Yeah, I hope that was an interesting contribution to your panel. I hope you find this work interesting. It's actually on display in the Museum of Art on campus. If you have an M card, you can come visit the museum right now, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, 9 to 5. Unfortunately, we're not open for other people yet, but this one is on display in the museum. Come check it out. Thanks for having me and my colleagues and for letting us contribute to your conference. Have a good time.
Sasha Krasnow is a lecturer, as I said, of Islamic arts in the residential college here at the University of Michigan. She writes on global contemporary art practices with a particular focus on Southwest Asian and North African issues of race, sociopolitics, gender, and sexuality. Her book project, The Age of Disillusionment, Palestinian Art After the Intifadas, is under review with Duke University Press. Today's talk stems from research that will be published as an essay in the forthcoming edited volume, A Strange Place Still, Religion in Contemporary Art, to be published by Routledge in 2022. Welcome, Sasha. We're very much looking forward to your presentation, and I'll hand it over to you when you're ready.
Thank you so much to Rima and to Kristen and to everyone else who was involved in putting this together. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. So my presentation today is titled Al-Buraq, Explorations of Liminality in Contemporary Islamic Art. And as Rima said, this paper is part of a current project that I'm working on that builds on my previous work on artists' queer articulations through hybrid figures. So this project looks at how one particular figure, specifically from Islamic mythology, the figure of Al-Buraq, is incorporated into contemporary Swana, Southwest Asia, North African artists' work. Additionally, I'm interested in how these artists are using the characteristics of Al-Buraq, in particular its liminality, to play with notions of their own or others' quote unquote in-between identities, or the boundaries between seemingly fixed categories of fact and fiction. In Islamic mythology, the Prophet Muhammad journeys from Mecca to Jerusalem to the heavens, hell, and back again in a single night. Al-Buraq, a human-headed flying steed, carries Muhammad on this night journey. Al-Buraq is a liminal creature. It is neither fully human nor fully animal. Grammatically, Al-Buraq is both masculine and feminine, and additionally, Al-Buraq is able to move between the earthly and spiritual worlds. It is this fluidity and in-betweenness that makes Al-Buraq a figure ripe for exploration of liminality in art, from articulations of queer and trans identities to ambiguities of fact and fiction. In this presentation, I'll discuss 3 artists' use of Al-Buraq in their contemporary practices, and in particular, how they utilize the creature's liminal state as productive in articulating other liminalities. As mentioned earlier, this work builds on previous work I've done looking at the use of hybrid mythological figures in queer Swana artists' work. And one artist who I discuss in that work is Durham-based artist Sabotage, who utilizes the liminal nature of Al-Buraq to articulate what I call their intersectional liminality, the liminal nature of both their queer, non-binary identity, as well as their Southern American, Pakistani, Kashmiri Muslim identity. Their kinetic sculpture, seen here, Interstellar Uber Negotiations with God, depicts Al-Buraq and is comprised of materials that articulate all these varying aspects of Sabotage's identity. The work is comprised of 5 partial mannequins. 3 mannequin lower bodies from the hips down constitute the 6 legs of Al-Buraq, traditionally depicted with just 4. A 4th mannequin torso and thighs make up the body, and a 5th mannequin torso and head complete the front of Al-Buraq. Al-Buraq's left and only arm is held up, making an ambiguous hand gesture typical of store mannequins that in this context resemble something akin to the benediction or a mudra. The 3 sets of legs are each different colors, the first in white, the middle in silver, and the rear legs a pink tone akin to mannequin representations of Caucasian skin, though these legs are covered by a pair of denim jeans. The other mannequins are different colors as well. The body is a dark brown, copper color with more denim reaching about halfway up its length, and the chest and head of the final mannequin radiate in gold. The figure of Al-Buraq is heavily adorned. The front and rear pairs of feet each wear glitter-covered roller skates in purple and silver respectively, and the middle pair of feet wear cream-colored stiletto heels. Glitter, flowers, and beads ornament Al-Buraq's skin throughout. A mohawked braid reveals gold geometric patterning, recalling Islamic mosaics along the sides of the head. A hobby horse emerges at the bottom of the headed torso above the front legs, taking the place of the head belonging to the mannequin torso making up the body. It serves a phallic function, protruding at the front of the figure and contrasting with the more feminized mop of hair placed between the front legs of Al-Buraq as pubic hair, on which the horse's gaze rests. The gaze of Al-Buraq is more difficult to assess, as a multitude of evil eyes are painted as a mask, dripping down the front of the face above a blackened mouth. Evil eyes also run down the sides and back of the figure, even coming to rest on the ground surrounding a cloud made of cotton and what appears to be small white sandbags upon which Al-Buraq stands. 2 large wings protrude from Al-Buraq's back. These are made of a variety of fabrics of different colors and patterns, including florals, glitter, leopard print, and gold, as well as beads and, as the artist refers to it in their description, baubles. A blue zigzag runs along the arm of each of the wings, a reference to one of the translations of Al-Buraq, lightning. The wings are the kinetic part of the sculpture. By opening and closing the window of the room in which it is installed at Elsewhere, an art space in Greensboro, North Carolina, the wings rise and fall. The use of Al-Buraq in Interstellar Uber articulates Sabotage's intersectional liminality as a queer femme Muslim living in the United States. As Al-Buraq is of indeterminate gender and grammatically Al-Buraq is both masculine and feminine, within the context of Islamic mythology, Al-Buraq is well suited to articulate non-normative gender expressions and queerness, as well as other realms in which these individuals may feel quote unquote othered. This liminality or in-betweenness is also emphasized by Al-Buraq's ability to move between the earthly and spiritual worlds, as during Al-Miraj or the night journey. This spiritual liminality is articulated by the fact that in Sabotage's work, Alburak stands on a bed of clouds, indicating the ability to travel between the earthly and spiritual realms. The liminality between the earthly and the spiritual is also highlighted by the location in which the work is installed. Called the ghost room, it is the most haunted corner of elsewhere, the space most closely connected to the other worlds. This space is where the physical and the spiritual meet and where borders and binaries, even those between living and dead, are called into question. This is further drawn out by the inclusion of ghosts as part of Sabatage's description of the medium of the work. They built the sculpture in this room and, quote, spent a lot of time with these ghosts during the creation process, end quote. Interstellar Uber then becomes not just a sculpture that articulates in-betweenness, but the liminality it expresses is underscored by the space in which it was created and resides as well. The various objects utilized in the composition of the sculpture all speak to various aspects that come together to form Sabatage's identity. As noted, Sabatage's Muslim identity is articulated through the use of the figure of Al-Buraq. The inclusion of the evil eye also connects to Sabatage's Muslim and South Asian identities, as beliefs about the power of this symbol to cause harm and to protect proliferate in these religious and cultural contexts. The idea that the gaze can cause harm is something Sabatage considers relevant to their experience as someone whose identity categories are often imposed from the outside by normative societies. Sabatage's use of blue jeans points to their American identity, and the inclusion of the glittered roller skates, stiletto heels, sparkling gold beads, and other bedazzled elements on Al-Buraq all point toward a queer femme identity. In using these elements, Sabatage marks the multiple ways in which they are liminal. They are American, but because of their Pakistani and Kashmiri Muslim identities, an American culture that privileges a normative identity that is white and Christian prevents them from fully feeling that they belong. They are Muslim, but their queer femme identity means that they do not conform to many of the rigid binaries and expectations of women in traditional Muslim cultures. They are Pakistani and Kashmiri, but the fact that they were born and raised in South Carolina means that they do not have the same experience of these identities as earlier generations of their family who were born and lived much or all of their lives in South Asia. Because of the ways in which the world they live in perceives each of these identities through systems of colonialism, racism, queerphobia, Islamophobia, among others, Sabatage experiences an intersectional liminality. However, through the use of the image of Al-Buraq, this experience of in-betweenness becomes an empowered one of possibility embodied by the hybrid. Sabatage's sculpture is jubilant in its combination of features related to their queer, Muslim, and Pakistani Kashmiri identities. The inclusion of glittered roller skates and cascading evil eyes, the phallic hobby horse and unapologetic mop of pubic hair, the expansive freedom encapsulated by the mobile wings, each of these elements is a declarative force of celebration of not only each of these elements, but their combination and interaction. Another artist who has taken up the figure of Al-Buraq in order to articulate expressions of gender identities that exist outside the binary is Lebanese artist Shaza Sharafadin. Sharafadin's interest in Al-Buraq came about as she was researching Islamic art history, and in particular, gendered representations throughout Islamic art. She was struck by the research of Asfana Najmabadi in her work, Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, where Najmabadi looks at changing notions of male and female beauty in Iran during the Qajar dynasty from the 7th to 20th centuries, from one of more ambiguity between men and women's beauty to one more resembling European perceptions. Sharafadin also noted that these more ambiguously gendered figures were articulated in Mughal artists' work, whose aesthetics were adopted from Persian miniatures in the 16th and 17th centuries, including depictions of Al-Buraq. She saw this in contrast to the popular imagery of Al-Buraq in the 20th century, specifically the 1940s, when a distinctly feminine human face was portrayed. Sharafadin was interested in exploring this shift, but also subverting it in her composite images that make up the Divine Comedy series, a reference to Dante's epic, which some scholars believe may have been influenced by Muhammad's night journey. To create each of her images, Sharafadin took a background from 16th to 18th century Persian and Turkish miniatures, as well as Mughal Islamic art. For instance, in this image, Sans Titre 6, Sharafadin used details from different plates of the Mirajnameh depicting the paradise that were produced in the 15th century at the illumination workshops of Herat. She then chose a depiction of the body of Al-Buraq from a selection of popular portrayals from Iran, India, Pakistan, and Egypt used in the 1940s. She then added a portrait of a feminine figure akin to those depicted in those 1940s popular images. However, the subjects themselves embody the liminality that Al-Buraq represents. For the faces of the Buraqs, Sharafadin photographed individuals who represent articulations of gender that don't adhere to a strict binary. Per Sharafadin, these models describe themselves as, quote, men who like to play women from time to time, transvestites, cross-dressers, transsexuals, and transgender individuals, end quote. These individuals' embodied articulations of gender are thereby liminal, not adhering to the binary, centering Al-Buraq as a symbol of this in-betweenness. Further emphasizing this liminality is the combination of sources from 3 different time periods. The background images sourced from artistic images centuries earlier, in the case of this image, a 16th century Persian miniature illustration, The Adulterous Couple, from the Baharistan of Jami, the bodies of the Buraqs coming from the mid-20th century, and the portraits as contemporary coming from the 21st century. In this sense, these works transgress the boundaries of time, perhaps making a claim to the ever-presence of varied articulations of gender. However, artists haven't just used the figure of Al-Buraq to articulate liminalities associated with gender. Mohammed Saeed Balbaki is a Lebanese artist who has used the liminality of Al-Buraq as a jumping off point for exploring the liminalities and ambiguities between fact and fiction, particularly those histories constructed by museum institutions. In his 3-part project, Al-Buraq, Balbaki creates a fictional museum dedicated to a retelling of the history of the Middle East. The first part, and I apologize that I don't have better images of this project currently, tells the story of a German archaeologist who discovered the skeleton of a winged creature during a dig in Jerusalem in 1914. After consulting with a number of other scientists and scholars in adjacent fields, it is suggested that the skeleton might be that of the mythical creature Al-Buraq. The installation includes the archive of correspondence and photographs related to the dig, and the scholarly discussions that led to this conclusion, as well as a replica skeleton of the Buraq, the quote-unquote original skeleton having been lost following the subsequent world wars and bombing of Berlin. Balbaki's story of Al-Buraq opens at the moment right before the historical events whose legacy would result in much of the continued strife in the region known as the Middle East. The First World War and subsequent division of the region between British and French in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, colonial exploitation and rule that would continue into the second half of the 20th century for many countries, and the loss of Middle Eastern heritage through colonial pillaging for quote-unquote preservation, only to have those objects be destroyed during the bombing campaigns during World War II. In displaying these objects in the style of a traditional archaeological or natural history museum in vitrines with accompanying explanatory text, Balbaki uses this familiar context to lend an air of authenticity to the narrative that he tells, while also problematizing the notion that the narratives that are told and contextualization of the objects shown in other museum contexts are inherently the whole truth. The work plays on visual references and historical knowledge that a viewer may quote unquote know as truth, such as the colonial history of the Middle East, the factual nature of museum displays, and by inserting the fantastical evidence of the existence of Al-Buraq, asks viewers to question the entire enterprise of history as objective and museum institutions as truth tellers. Balbaki's project thereby problematizes the notion of a black and white division between fact and fiction and reveals the liminal nature of the histories that are told, the blurred lines between artifact and artifice. The liminal figure of Al-Buraq emphasizes this further. The work also serves to blur the boundaries between science and myth. This is perhaps most drawn out directly in the skeletal drawings attributed to 2 of the German scientists. While the rest of the installation does include illustrative images of Al-Buraq, the skeletal drawings reduce the nature of the fantastical down to the anatomical, the scientific. These drawings recall both medical journals, but also the anatomical illustrations of Michelangelo and Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, linking the typically perceived as objective science to the subjective creativity of art and the possibility of what might be embodied by myth. It also highlights the supremacy that hegemonic Euro-American societal expectations put on evidence sourced through scientific artifact, rather than giving due to the possibility of mythological storytelling as historical artifact in and of itself. A detail in the story of the discovery of Al-Buraq's bones gestures toward another element of liminality. In Baldaki's story, the German archaeologist discovers the bones buried in a suitcase. The suitcase, a common motif in Baldaki's work, references immigration and the migrant diasporic experience, including Baldaki's own as a Lebanese-born artist now living in Berlin. The suitcase references travel or a journey, much like Muhammad's night journey on Al-Buraq. The immigrant experience is similarly liminal to the night journey, and that the immigrant is always both where they came from and where they now reside, an experience described by Edward Said as contrapuntal and Homi Bhabha as hybridity. The immigrant experience therefore collapses time and space and exists in a temporal and geographical in-between. The works discussed today are just 3 examples of contemporary Swana artists using the figure of Al-Buraq in their works. Notably, all 3 instrumentalized the liminality of Al-Buraq as an in-between creature whose journey transgresses earthly planes as a mode for exploring other aspects of liminality, be those queer, non-binary identifications, or the blurry space between fact and fiction. It is fitting that it is a mythological figure that is at the root of these articulations, as they are all asking viewers to rethink what is and what might be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you so much. A very provocative, in the best sense of that word's meaning, presentation. We look forward to asking questions to you and to Kenji. I will move on to our third speaker. Christopher Checklian is a postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University in the Netherlands. He's part of the Rewriting Global Orthodoxy project in the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion. He has published work on liturgy and law in the lives of religious minorities, including Promises of Property, Religious Foundations, and the Justice and Development Party's Ambiguous Attitudes Towards Religious Minorities in the journal Turkish Studies, I'm getting ahead of myself. Currently, he is working on a monograph entitled Singing the City, the Armenian Liturgical Subject and Minority Belonging in Istanbul. Welcome, Christopher. We're so looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I will share my screen as I say my other thank yous. It's really a pleasure to virtually at least be back at the University of Michigan, where I spent a year as a Manugian postdoctoral fellow. And so in addition to all the organizers of the conference, I want to especially thank the Center for Armenian Studies who invited me specifically. So I'm really thrilled. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm calling the resonances of Armenian liturgical music, staying from the minaret to the concert hall. And what I'm going to do today is give a kind of an overview of Armenian liturgical music, look at a particular case here in Istanbul, as you can see. I'm doing one thing to make sure we have sound. I'm going to have a lot of audio, so I might need that 5-minute warning because I'm largely going to have a lot of good music for you, hopefully. And then after kind of thinking through this one case, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other further resonances of Armenian liturgical music and how they've been taken up by more contemporary composers as a way of thinking about the same questions that my case in Istanbul raises about kind of minority emplacement, the use of tradition, and sort of liturgical life as it bleeds beyond just the context of liturgy itself. So without further ado, let's begin with a little bit. Here is a beautiful manuscript page that's from a collection at the University of Chicago showing the musical notation called the khaz that we'll get a little bit more. And I want to give you a nice example of one of the most well-known Armenian liturgical pieces. And that just little clip, because we'll come back to it, was actually by Onik Dinkchen, who is a well-known folk singer as well. And it sort of helps make my point right from the start that this well-known folk singer recorded an album called Havadank, We Believe, that was basically all liturgical music. So you can see from the outset that there's a kind of important sort of use of this liturgical music by Armenian performers. And in fact, actually, Onik Dinkchen, one of the sort of the great performers and folk singers of our time, there's going to be, I believe today, actually, a video called Cross Country Visit with the National Endowment for the Arts National Heritage Fellows, where Onik will be featured today. So I thought that was a nice way to sort of introduce a little bit. So just as kind of big picture background here, what we're looking at is kind of a map of what is often called historical Armenia or the Armenian highlands, which includes today's Republic of Armenia, as well as a lot of Eastern Turkey and kind of just that entire region. So you could see kind of important Armenian sites. And the Armenians are sort of proudly claim to be the first Christian nation. And what you're looking at here is the Cathedral of Holy Echmiadzin, which was sort of founded not too far after Christianity was adopted in Armenia. The traditional date is 301 AD. This is actually, no matter how you sort of deal with the niceties of historical dating, one of the oldest above ground Christian cathedrals in the world. So thinking about arts of devotion, you're going to see some examples here as well of the music of Armenian architecture. So Armenian church architecture is kind of one of the great exemplars of sacred art as well. So in addition to here at Echmiadzin, the Armenian church sort of spread throughout the region along with different political authorities. So this is the sort of fortress of Hormkala in present-day Turkey, which was the seat of the Armenian church for a while as well. The seat of the church sort of followed around political entities. So here you can see some of those political entities, including I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but the sort of the darkest red is the current day Republic of Armenia. Hormkala is down in that little striped area called Cilicia, and you can see the sort of the extent of some of these other Armenian kingdoms. This is a bit from the city of Ani, known as the city of 1,001 churches, which was one of the seats of the Bagratuni kingdom from about 885 to 1045 AD. And this church, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross on the island of Akhdamar at Lake Van, also in present-day Turkey, was one of the seats of the kingdom of Vasburagan, which lasted from about 908 to 1021 AD. So we see that the Armenian church and its sort of arts of devotion, its sacred arts, has been integral to the Armenian political process, as well as what we might just call Armenian culture broadly. And from the outset, music has been a part of this liturgical and ecclesial sort of output. So Saint Sahag Partev, pictured here from a book of the lives of the saints, who was the head of the church who oversaw the creation of a unique Armenian alphabet, is also considered to be one of the originators of the Armenian liturgical musical system. So you see that at the very outset of a unique Armenian church and liturgical output, the musical aspect of that is right there at the beginning. The extent to which this early Catholicos, the head of the Armenian church, actually wrote some of the hymns attributed to him. Of course, you know, we can question those things, but it's sort of important in its own right to note that this early Catholicos is seen as being one of the originators of the musical system. It just sort of goes to show how central that musical system is to Armenian church and liturgical practice. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of music theory, but to move into the specifics of some of the Armenian liturgical music, most of it is built on a modal system of music. So what are called sharagans, which is a genre of hymn. There are other hymns of the church, but the most common are known as sharagans, are all built on this modal system. So here is a kind of nice description of mode versus scale. And if you read the work of anybody working on sort of Middle Eastern music in general or other modal music, you know, there's a lot of debate about what exactly constitutes a mode. I don't want to get too far into that other than to go ahead and call the basis of Armenian liturgical music a modal system. So the Armenian modal system are called sign, which means literally voice. It can mean sound, or in this technical terminology, it can mean mode. So the polyvalence of that term, I think, is kind of fascinating in its own right. So each of the sharagans, the specific genre of hymn, are known, are given a particular sign. There are 8 basic signs, modes, as well as a number of modulated modes, which are called tartsvats, which basically just means sort of turned, or, you know, we could literally say modulated. They're given in a set of pairings. So in Armenian, aiptsa, aipgen, pensa, pengen, kimsa, kimgen, tatsa, tagen. And this comes from actually the reliance on the Byzantine octoekos system, where basically the sign, the aiptsa and the aipgen would, in the Greek system, have some kind of musical relationship to each other. Now, maybe they did in the Armenian system originally, but today they don't. So even though golm means side, which suggests that there's a musical relationship between the two modes of aiptsa and aipgen, today there isn't actually a musical connection between them. And most of these modes also have further modulated versions, these tartsvats. So this is like the sort of the full chart of the different modes and the way that you can see that they in theory are paired up. So the first voice or mode, sign, and the first golm, the first side. And you go through with these, and each of the hymns is given a designation as to how to sing it based off of one of these modes. So when you then come to thinking about the way that one writes these out or one learns them, it's heavily dependent on the modes. And in fact, for centuries, there was not a full sort of transcription of these hymns. There were these neumes, so we'll take a look at them in a second, that then went with the modes, which told you how to sing each of these different hymns. So we'll get some examples here in a second. I just want to sort of note, before I go into some of these examples, that the modal systems of the different Eastern Christian churches have some similarities between them. As I mentioned, the Byzantine octoekos definitely influenced the Armenian system. The Syriac Orthodox Church also has a kind of modal system that definitely influenced the Armenian system as well. And I want to mention the work of Tala Jarjur, especially her book Sense and Sadness, which is one of the most interesting and complete monographs looking at these the Oriental Orthodox churches, especially. She's looking at the Syriac Church and the way that these modal systems play out, which has been one of my kind of interests, is to think about these liturgical musical systems and the way that they connect to the larger community. So let's hear a little bit. This is actually an example that a friend of mine, Ryan Talalian, recorded for me. So this is an example in Ta Gen, which is actually the last mode.
Medasuste ans nimas jevsenzaste hoki mastud so perchavimov.
So I won't sing too much to give you my terrible voice, but if you notice that sort of that end, imov, we're going to hear a few more examples in Tagen, and then when I play some of the later compositions, keep your ear open for these repeated musical patterns, because that really gives a sense of what a mode does, right? It's those musical patterns as well. So as I mentioned, over the years, the ways that these hymns were notated were first in what's called the pneumatic system of the Chaz, which this is a close-up of that first manuscript that I showed you. And you can see a lot of the different markings on the page. Unfortunately, we've actually lost the ability to understand these Chaz completely, such that by the 1800s, a new system was developed. So here's a picture of some of these symbols. And there's been a lot of work trying to sort of rediscover their meanings, but they remain opaque to us, even though even the printed version of a lot of the manuscript hymnals continue to print these notations. They're not actually readable. So in the 1800s, a new system was developed that used the old neumes, but use them in a different way to actually begin to transcribe them. So this is an example of that system. It's called the Hampartsum notation, and the work of Haig Utichen, as well as Aram Kevropian, really is the most current for thinking about the development of these systems and their the way that they have been used. So this Hampartsum notation gives you basically it's using the solfege system to give you sort of ups and downs. So it's much more of a transcription, but you can see that it basically is using these old neumes in order to create a new system. And you'll see here, this is in Tagen as well. And then here's an example of, it's actually the exact same hymn, which is sung on Palm Sunday, not too far from now. And here's the sort of a modern notation version of it taken from the St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary's website. And again, just to give you another example in this Tagen, so you can hear a little bit, notated here this way, and in this, in the modern Western notation, here's this hymn. So because I'm running out of time, I could have you listen to lots and lots of music, but hopefully that little flourish gave you enough to begin to sort of hear these patterns. So when we're talking about these modes, one of the things when I was doing my research in Istanbul that really struck me was that the Armenians of Istanbul talked about these modes using Turkish or Arabic makam names for them, which is the sort of the modal system of music throughout the Middle East, of makams, which is shared throughout the Middle East. And I found that sort of striking, and it led me into one of the first ways that I thought of this Armenian liturgical music as resonating, say, beyond the walls of the church. And what I have here is the correspondences between the Armenian names for these modes and the different modes in the Arabic or Turkish makam names. And this had always sort of got me thinking about, what is going on here? Is this translation? And ultimately I decided that it wasn't sort of a direct translation, but it was actually a way of being emplaced within the city and sort of taking your liturgical tradition and being able to use it in different circumstances. Now, of course, when they use the names, that's a kind of translation, and maybe in the questions we can talk about this. But I found that for what I call a liturgical subject, somebody who's really been inundated, trained, sort of had their subject position activated within the liturgy of the church, singing these hymns in the different modes over and over and over again, it becomes a kind of, you tune your ear in a way that then actually might place you in the city in a particular way. So this is the first way that I want to talk about the liturgical music sort of coming out of the walls of the church. So here's a kind of stylized map of Istanbul from a publication done by the Hrant Dink Foundation that gives you a sense of all the Armenian churches located throughout Istanbul. You can see there's quite a few of them. And of those, most of them are Armenian Apostolic churches of the denomination that I was showing you the pictures of the cathedrals before. And one of the striking things about this is that, you know, some of these churches, you can see, this is an example in Galata, that you can actually see that Armenian style dome on the streets of Istanbul, but that's actually quite rare. More often, these churches are kind of behind walls, and the liturgy stays within the walls, and Armenian existence is kind of behind those walls. So acoustically, I always found it's quite striking when things encountered each other, when the sounds of the city and the liturgical sounds would sort of butt up against each other and encounter each other. Here's a really wonderful example, one of my favorites. You can see the minaret of the mosque that is right next to the church here, and this is a recording from my fieldwork. So what's happened here is that an instructor of mine who was helping me with my own liturgical music was helping me after church one day in the church and was giving his lesson when the call to prayer began next door. And he actually, it's quite beautiful. He says in a kind of mix of Turkish and Armenian, he says, oh, you know, the Hoja, the muezzin's voice is coming. That's okay, let's continue. And then he sings, and it actually sort of matches up quite nicely. And this was one of the things that sort of got me thinking about this, the way in which the sort of dominant soundscape of Istanbul, of you know, the call to prayer, of the mosque, could encounter a minority liturgical musical tradition, and what that might mean to be a minority in the city. The ways in which the affective, emotional, and sensory experience of minority life comes to emplace the minority citizen subject within the urban landscape of Istanbul. And this is something I'm continuing to write about and continuing to work on. And I want to just give you a little bit more auditory example of the way in which this works, that a minority Armenian subject, citizen, actually can hear themselves in the soundscape of the city. And so it's a way that I'm beginning to think about minority belonging related to the sort of the sensory and the affective, the auditory aspects of minority belonging, especially in an urban environment. So this is a lovely little chapel on site of an Armenian hospital.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
And so I'll give you the auditory before I give you the explanation there. So from that little chapel, you could, as with many Armenian churches, you could hear the call to prayer every day. And hearing the call to prayer one time, one of the people that I served with, that was weekly there at the chapel, sort of heard the call to prayer and asked her music instructor if it was in a particular makam, and she used the makam name, or she used, sorry, the sign name, the Armenian liturgical name, to name the musical mode of the call to prayer. And as you can hear there, that was a super, you know, a sort of playing the two of them at the same time. One of the call to prayer and one of the hymns that more or less matches. I'm still sort of trying to get that auditory thing exactly right. But when you listen to that, you can hear how this Armenian liturgical tradition can actually align you with the dominant auditory soundscape of Istanbul. So this is a really, I think, important way of thinking about how a religious minority might emplace themselves in an urban landscape, in a city, and in, you know, in as a citizen, as a minority citizen, in a country. It's a way that I'm thinking about minority belonging. So I know I'm probably going to be pushing my time here pretty soon, but the other way that I want to kind of spend just a couple minutes is to note that this liturgical music in its resonances beyond the walls of the church has been incredibly generative and a way for Armenians to sort of find belonging wherever they go. So this is a very famous Gomidas Vartabed, who was an ethnomusicologist as well as an arranger of liturgical music, a priest as well as an ethnomusicologist. And Silvia Alajaji has written a really wonderful book called Music in the Armenian Diaspora, Searching for Home in Exile, that I think takes my point about minority belonging and brings it into a sort of diasporic setting and thinking about exile and belonging and home through music, and specifically through the resonances of liturgical music. So I'm going to leave you with that idea, but I'm going to play just a little bit more music because I can't help myself, and then I will stop and be happy to take questions. So here's a little bit. This is actually Gomidas's voice itself from an early recording in the 1900s. He lived from 1869 to 1935. So I'm not going to play all of these other examples, but I will just point to a couple recent composers who have made use of liturgical music in thinking with Silvia Alajaji about how this liturgical music in particular has helped create a sort of sense of belonging and of home in exile and diaspora after the Armenian genocide. So Alan Hovanes is explicitly using music, sometimes that was arranged by Gomidas in his work. So this is an arrangement of a song, Urachler, that Gomidas actually had an arrangement of. So you can hear here that it doesn't sound like liturgical music, but he's using the melody here and playing with it. So Alan Hovanes was an American Armenian composer. Arno Babajanian, and a Soviet Armenian composer, often did the same thing. And I'll just end with Tigran Hamasyan, who is a contemporary jazz pianist who composed, among other things, an entire series of songs in 5 years ago for the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And I'll play this and then I will cede the floor. So I know I pushed my time limit there, but thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you. Indeed, the Q&A session has begun. Thank you to Kenji, Sasha, and Christopher. Without further ado, I would like to begin with the first question. Thank you for your patience until we have finished with the presentation. Here's a question for Sasha. Sasha, my colleague Kristen Waterbury at the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies is wondering, how have some of these newer art pieces been received by viewers in the art world? What about those who are religious, like by people who purport to have a religiosity? It comes to mind because the question comes to mind because some of the pieces can certainly be interpreted or understood as provocative.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I guess I can start answering that with a bit of an anecdote from Shaza Sharafadin, where when she, I think one of the first times, if not the first time, she exhibited the series from the Divine Comedy in Beirut, that there was a collector who she knew, who came and saw the works and asked her if she could redo them, but with someone who was born a woman, fit more of his expectations of what a woman was, ignoring the fact that trans women are women, but she declined, and ultimately he bought the piece anyway. And so I think it really depends. Sabotage is based in the US and she's exhibiting in the US. And so that has kind of a different perhaps context. But I think there definitely is, it's interesting. There is maybe some occasional, at least preliminary resistance to some of the works because of their potentially provocative nature. But what's interesting is that with all of these artists, because they're, and Sharafadin in particular is really drawing this out, this connection between historic roots, right? The reality that this is rooted in kind of an earlier, Islamic world, if we want to kind of give a broad category to it, understanding of gender and gender ambiguities, and that this kind of, the ideas about gender that we have contemporarily and sexuality as well are not aligned with these historic ones. And so to kind of bring that back and link that past and present, I think that's actually something that's particularly interesting, because she sort of is standing on a historic footing in terms of these representations. So I also would say that that these works are tending to be exhibited, for an arts community, and that arts community, tends to at least see itself as more progressive. Whether or not that's the reality is kind of a whole other conversation. But I think that depending, if these works were exhibited in maybe more of like a public space, that it would be interesting to see the different ways that that different audiences reacted to it, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sasha. I'm also thinking, just as you were speaking, about the interesting figure of Al-Buraq as both female and male, kind of completely self-contained and dependent, even in terms of reproduction, right? There's just this one of a kind, and there is no other for it to have been reproduced in the past by some other creature and to continue reproduction. So very interesting idea there. So lots of great questions. I'll move on. I have one for Chris right here. And forgive me, I think I lost the name of the author of this question. I apologize. The question is, you mentioned how much of this liturgical music is contained within walls, and how interesting it was when it interacted with the call to prayer. Are there other ways Armenian churches try to share this music with wider audiences or with diaspora beyond the borders of Istanbul, beyond the walls of churches? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I definitely sort of got, I pushed my time limit by trying to share so much music. And part of what I was hoping to sort of show in that second part was that actually through the compositions of 20th century composers, especially, that this liturgical music has been sort of pushed in all kinds of ways and taken to lots of different audiences. And one of the interesting things about, somebody like Tigran Hamasyan, the jazz pianist, is that, he sometimes does things like use modes and Armenian modes and makams in his compositions, but then he also has recorded this album that is just explicitly liturgical music. Or Onik Dinkchen, as another example, is somebody who, there it's more folk when it comes to the makams, but is doing compositions and is is using the sort of broad system of music, but then also will record an album called Havadam, we believe, that is an entirely liturgical album. So there's a sense in which the liturgical music can be performed. And one of the things in my work in Istanbul in particular was I kind of played with that and looked at some of that because, for instance, there would be like school choir shows that the schools would put on, and inevitably there would be liturgical music sung by the school choirs at these shows. Now those are directed more towards the community, the Armenian community itself, but I think that's an interesting example of kind of thinking, what is the border between liturgical music and other kinds of music? Is, if you perform liturgical music on a stage, does it stop being liturgical? Is this a question of ritual setting, or is it a question of the musicality itself? And I think these are all interesting questions that are raised by the performance outside of a liturgical setting of liturgical music. I think there are lots of other ways I can answer your question, but thank you for that.
Thank you as well. As I go to the next question, it reminds me very much, Christopher, I watched a program about the Black Church in the United States, the role of the church, and about a lot of controversy about taking church music, singing out into profane spaces to raise monies for Black empowerment movements. So very interesting stuff here. I have a question for Sasha. If you'd like to address that first, I'll then open it up to everyone, but I believe that you might be the most appropriate person. It's from Fang Zhang, who is a lecturer in the history of art and in the Penny W. Stamps School of Art and Design. Very broad question he offers. Are there many artists who work on religious themes? Please tell me how their works are received by art critics and the art market. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question and is really kind of the focus of this edited volume that this work is ultimately going to be a part of, is really an exploration of this idea because, so much there has been this idea, kind of with the advent of modernism kind of going along with secularism. So this idea that there was a rejection of religion in favor of rationality, and that this comes out through the arts as well, and that religious arts kind of goes by the wayside unless it's kind of an overt rejection, or even some would argue insults to religion, happening in the arts. But some things that I've been working on in terms of, organizing a panel that's going to be at the Middle Eastern Studies Association conference this fall, looking specifically at Islamic influences in contemporary art. And then this edited volume that I'm going to be a part of with this work is looking at contemporary artists who are using elements of the religious in their works. And so I also think that it's worthwhile to make a distinction between work that is serving a religious function, is devotional itself, rather than incorporating elements of devotion or of religious practice. I don't have kind of a number of how many artists are doing this, but it's definitely something that, modern contemporary art is kind of presented with this illusion of being, purely secular. And there are definitely scholars who are interested in looking at the reality that is not necessarily the case. And I think it really depends in terms of the art market and interests. I think that, part of what an art market fascination is with, again, the kind of quote unquote Islamic world is a fascination with Islam. So I think that in part, there is an interest in that, though, again, then there's challenges of being able to kind of open up the ideas of what kind of the art market and collectors and curators are expecting to see out of interpretations or representations of Islam versus kind of the breadth of what artists are actually exploring. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely, yes. I'm going to move on. Lots of great questions here. I have one for you, Chris, please. And it is from a fellow presenter, Suzanne Davis. She's at the University of Michigan's Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. Do you think, she says, in addition to aligning musical modes for a sense of belonging, there is any attempt to use modes or melody or other aspects to distinguish minority identity in Istanbul, or to say beyond the church walls, here we are in the city soundscape?
Thank you for that question, Suzanne. That's a really good question, right? So, you know, what you're sort of saying, right, is that I've emphasized the way in which these modes help sort of align the minority with the soundscape of sort of the dominant aspects of the soundscape. And, you know, we can also then ask, you know, does this maybe distinguish? And, you know, I think that certainly modes, certain compositions are definitely, this is done. So you see albums that are put out that are sort of like, you know, these are ours, these are our songs. Of course, you know, the arguments over these is really fascinating. So there's actually a documentary that was produced about this song. In Turkish, the title is Sarıgelin, which is then, like, there are Armenian lyrics, I think there are Kurdish lyrics, I think there are Greek lyrics, and everybody uses the same melody. And so there's this, it's a really wonderful sort of look through this sort of single song about these sort of positions, right? Whose is it? Who gets to claim belonging over these spaces, over the city? And, you know, the other question is sort of then of contribution, right? What are the contributions of each of these different peoples to the fabric of the modern Republic of Turkey, you know, over the centuries through the Ottoman Empire, etc. So I mentioned that notation system of Hampartsum Limonchen, and this was actually the first notation system that was developed in the Ottoman Empire that was intended for sort of modal, you know, Middle Eastern music. So it was actually not used only for Armenian liturgical music, but was also used to notate Turkish folk, you know, what was called sort of Ottoman classical music. So that actually there's a lot of melodies of, you know, shared folk songs and Ottoman classical music that we have those melodies because they were written down in the 19th century using this notation developed by Hampartsum Limonchen. And an instructor, a sort of church singing expert who also gives lectures and things, once told me that he found it so sort of striking and a little sad that actually you have Turkish musicology students that came to him who wanted to learn this notation system, whereas those singing in the church context didn't really care about it, because now most of the hymns are, you can find modern, you know, Western annotations of these hymns. So there's definitely ways in which the music becomes a way of you know, planting flags or staking claims or saying, you know, hey, this is our contribution, or we are a part of this, or, you know, we are definitely here. And there are ways of doing that, you know, that are, some are more separatist than others, right? Some are sort of say, hey, we're part of this broad fabric, whereas I think others are much more saying, you know, hey, this is ours. Yeah, thank you again for that question. This is a really great, I think, go in different directions with it, but hopefully that gets at what you're asking. Thank you.
Absolutely. And in fact, it kind of gets me into the back door of this question, so to speak. It's you've begun to address this, but it's from my colleague, Kristen Waterbury at the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, Chris, and she wants to know, very interested in the Islamic and the Armenian, the audio blending with one another. Oh, sorry, because my video wasn't on. She's wondering how has the Muslim Turkish population appreciation for this, the minority music culture of Armenians, how have they taken to it?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, and I would say that this is one of these things that, you know, have sort of ebbed and flowed in the modern history of the Republic of Turkey, right? So, you know, sort of famously, a lot of Kurdish language things were not allowed for much of the history of the Republic. And so in the the early years of the Justice and Development Party in the 2000s, through what we might call kind of the golden age, was really kind of 2005 through about 2012, up to 2013 with the Gezi Park protests, which fortunately for me coincided with a lot of my field work. There was a lot of appreciation for these things. And in fact, there was not just in music, but in general, a kind of unearthing of these things. One of the most famous examples is there was a book called Ana, my grandmother, where a well-known sort of Turkish intellectual came out because her grandmother, basically on her deathbed, let her know that she was Armenian. And so in general, there was a kind of appreciation of these things. There were music groups that sang Armenian folk songs and recorded in them. And those albums did rather well. People bought them. Same thing with Kurdish folk songs. So that period, I would really say kind of the early 2000s until that Gezi Park moment, there was a sort of flurry of interest in these things. And again, this is the same moment you'll see translations of Armenian literature into Turkish. And these things have continued through the work, say, of Aras Publishing House, but that sort of desire and appetite for them went along with a general kind of opening up in Turkish society that, unfortunately now that moment has largely passed. And I hope that we return to that moment. But I would say that there really was a kind of golden age of appreciation that now we're on the other side of. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Christopher. We have a few minutes left, and I would love to open the floor up to our three presenters and speakers. If either one of you would like to engage in a conversation or questions, remarks for one another. I feel like it's been very unidirectional, and I'd like it to be multi-directional. So this is an opportunity I'd like to offer to the three of you to have a conversation with one another, if you would like.
Well, first I just say thank you. I think that's a great opportunity. Sasha, I was really struck in your answer, but obviously the way that you talked about this artwork of sort of distinguishing like uses and purposes, right? Like, saying like, is it a devotional piece, or is it sort of making use of devotional art? And I think that that's important, but it clearly goes with what I'm sort of talking about, like with where the liturgical music is placed and how it gets sort of taken up. But I also like wonder about those distinctions. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because I like, on the one hand, I viscerally think that they make sense, but then at the same time, I'm sort of like, well, but like, are we just sort of, is that a rehashing of a sort of, easy secularization, or are we relying on intention, right? Are we saying like the intention of the artist or the intention of the recording, is that what matters? So I would be curious if you have thoughts on like intention and secularization in that context.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that, just because something isn't meant to be like used in a religious context, and it's just using aspects of like the devotional or the religious, doesn't make it like secular. So I think that's important too, right? And so it can still be like an articulation of one's, potentially like individual religious identity, or meant to have kind of a religious cultural affiliation without it being kind of necessarily like used in religious practice. And I mean, I'm thinking about this in the context of when we think of, religious painting or reliquaries, or these objects that were really a part of religious practice. But the religious art obviously is more encompassing than just those objects, for sure. And I also completely agree that, we always want to think about what is the artist's intention, but then it also goes out in the world, right? And then how is it interacted with? So, an artist, I mean, people talk about art that has nothing inherently to do with religion to like view a work of art or experience a work of art as a religious experience, right? So I mean, I think there's also that aspect of what might be, an artist's articulation of their own religious identity and how it conflicts or complements other aspects of their identity through using a figure of Al-Buraq or some other aspect of their religious identity, depending on the person viewing it or interacting with it. They may have a religious affiliation or a religious experience with it, or it may open up something in their own religious identity, or it may not, in part depending on their own identification, in part depending on their own relationship to, even if they're another queer Muslim, their own relationship between those two aspects of their identity. So I think it's definitely not a fixed thing, for sure. And so I think I make the distinction between those categorizations just because I do think it is important to think about how the art is functioning, but that those aren't like a religion versus secular division, right? That they're always, I mean, if nothing else from my presentation, I think what's been displayed is boundaries are blurred, right? And so I think that's a key thing, but a really important conversation to continue.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that, because I really, like, for me, I think, like, again, the sort of, it's more interesting to take a look at like what the uses are and what happens when they get put out in the world and how they're taken up, than to get too caught up on like what, is the aura there so it's religious or something like that, right? Like, it's much more interesting to take a look at all these, like, these uptakes and transferences. So thank you.
Thank you as well. Absolutely. We have 1 minute, but I think unless Kenji, Sasha, would you like to? Seems like you leaned in. Yeah. Yes.
Nope. It wasn't a lean.
Fine. It's absolutely fine. It actually makes me think, as you just spoke, Christopher, it made me think to go back to the Apsara Warrior, the dancer, of how a remarkable figure, no doubt, but now in the museum in Ann Arbor, like, in the function must be different, right? To think about both of your points, like the original intention, the original impulse, the messaging being sent, but now it's in an entirely different space and context, and what happens there. So I, of course, want to thank Christopher, Kenji, and Sasha for a remarkably interesting and provocative and textual presentations. Thank you so much to all three of you. It's been quite a wonderful experience for me and for our audience. And without further ado, I will call it a Zoom meeting. Thank you, everyone.